Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled Global Call of Power to the People. I'm joined by Jacoby Williams, past fellow at the Center 2016-17, also the Ruth N. Halls Associate Professor and Chair, the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, and the Department of History at Indiana University. Today is January the 20th. Welcome, everyone. As always, I very much appreciate you choosing to spend 90 minutes with us in the middle of your work week. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President of Education Programs at the Center, and on behalf of my staff, Jira, Mike, and Meredith, I want to again welcome you back to the webinar program and series. As you've signed up for and attended many of our episodes this year, I hope that you see certain themes begin to emerge, and perhaps you predict them. One of those themes certainly is social justice and understanding how we can better teach issues of race and place in social justice. And it seems to me that the more you know and the more context you have and the more emergent understandings you have of these topics, the more effective that you can be. In addition to welcome you, I want to reach out and thank some of you individually for joining us tonight. It's always great to see Lucy with us. Lucy's from North Henderson High School. Laura's joining us from the St. Louis Public Library. Wendy from St. Paul, Minneapolis, the Twin Cities up in Minnesota. Always great to see Tisha, who's at the Hopkins School in Connecticut. And Maya's here from Walton High School outside of Atlanta. I think Maya might be a student, and if so, I very much appreciate you being here. As always, we have numerous Los Angeles Unified educators with us, Derek, Felicia, Ashley, among others. Thank you again for joining us on this night. And hey, Jill Williams, I see you in the room as well. Thanks for joining us from Western Albemarle County, just outside of Charlottesville. The center, as you know, is located in Durham, North Carolina, and just like many of you here in the Southeast and East Coast, we're anxiously looking at the weather tomorrow and whether or not the snow will sock us in. I happen to join you tonight from Washington, D.C., from the nation's capital, which seems to be an appropriate place to lead this conversation. And one of the things that, one of the primary foci really of the center is to support scholars like Professor Williams in the work and the research that they're doing. Professor Williams was with us several years ago and spent the entire academic calendar year at the center doing research, giving talks, exploring with no distractions and no encumbrances this very powerful topic. And really at the heart of the center and the work that we do is to give those scholars the kind of support and the kind of environment that they can use to be very innovative and creative. Then that extends to these kinds of events where, again, it seems to me that the more you know, the better you're able to make these connections in your curriculum and in your classroom. Of course, it's always nice to have materials to do that. I do encourage you to use the Humanities in Class digital library to find free and open resources that you can use to address not only this topic of the Black Panther Party, but really many and numerous angles of teaching race and place and social justice. That does include the readings that are associated with tonight. These readings were provided and assigned by Professor Williams in advance. If you didn't have a chance to get to them because you're very busy educators, then I encourage you to go back after tonight's show and read them and sort of reflect on how they contribute to and maximize your understanding. That will include the recording of tonight's session. So within a couple of days, we'll have that loaded and in the library as well. We'll have not only the full-length 90-minute version, but also we'll go through and edit it into smaller topical chunks that you can share with your students, perhaps offer as a formative prompt or maybe a flipped classroom model where your students listen to these, view these for homework. I do encourage you also to look at the upcoming webinars. I think we have, somewhere around 17 or 18 left before the end of April. And many of them do focus on this notion of global connections, of taking a topic and really trying to understand better how it's not restricted to and confined by either time or place, location or person. That does include our session with Valerie Hansen from Yale, titled A Trip Around the World in the Year 1000. Also our work with Thomas McDowell on finding the historical roots of Black Panther, with Chris Capizella from MIT around the ways that the United States and the Philippines built America's first Pacific century. And then finally in April, Tate Keller, another past fellow, who will be sharing his work on the global environmental impact of World War I. Of course, each of our webinars earn 5 professional development credit hours. For all of us, that's an important way to not only engage in activities that help support us as educators, but it likely is something that you need for your teaching portfolio. If you find that you're either really interested in going more of a deep dive into a topic, or you would like to earn a big chunk of points, I invite you to consider the online course catalog. We have numerous new courses in this catalog, including this one, Empowering Maptivists, using maps and data to examine social issues in the humanities classroom. And with about 5 hours of work per week over about 5 or 6 weeks, this is essentially the same amount of time that you might add and give to a webinar. But again, it's done in one big chunk and through this online course. Please check out our website and you can register for those as you see fit. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce you, now that we're in the new year, to summer opportunities. We're all anxiously watching the uptick in Omicron and trying our best to pay attention to the public safety and making sure that everybody is protected. We are planning, however, right now to offer 2 different on-site at the Center Institutes for Teachers in July of 2022. The first one we are currently accepting applications for, titled Contested Territory, America's Involvement in Southeast Asia, 1945 to 1975. These 10 days will focus on understanding the many intricate layers of Southeast Asia, of Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and in particular Vietnam, so we can better understand America's role in that region in the mid-20th century. We're currently accepting applications. The applications are due by March the 25th. And if you're selected, then you will receive a $2,200 stipend that covers all travel, because we will ask you to come to Durham and be at the center for these 2 weeks. I'm also thrilled to announce a brand new program in collaboration with Prairie View A&M University in Houston, Texas. Annually, each summer, we will be offering a 5-day Institute for Teachers on teaching race, place, and social justice. We're still tweaking the actual topic that we'll study this summer, and I'll be able to announce that very soon. But we are hoping to welcome 20 to 25 teachers from around the country to the center. You will receive a stipend plus full travel support to come to North Carolina for that week and spend time with scholars working at the center. The application process will open next month, and I'll be sure to share that both in our newsletters and in our digital library, as well as in our webinars. So tonight's webinar, as you know, is audio only. I do encourage you, however, to be actively engaged both with each other and with Professor Williams. With each other, you can use the audience chat, ask questions, chatter, share URLs, make comments. But if you want to submit a formal question, then please use the Ask the Professor tab, Ask Professor Williams tab. And that'll come to me directly as the moderator, and I'll find the appropriate time to pause Professor Williams's presentation, bring those questions to him, and offer you the clarifications that you've asked for. So again, you have joined us for the Humanities Class webinar titled Global Call of Power to the People. It's being led tonight by Jacoby Williams, past fellow of the center and currently the Associate Professor and Chair of the African American and African Diaspora Studies and Department of History at Indiana University. Tonight's TA, I'm pleased to welcome Elena Samkin. Elena is a high school teacher at Pinecrest High School in Southern Pines, North Carolina, about an hour and a half south of Chapel Hill. She's going to be in the chat box sharing some links that she's curated, asking some questions, and generally helping us think about ways to connect this to our classrooms. So with that introduction, Jacoby, hey, can you hear me over in Bloomington, Indiana?
I can hear you just fine. I hope everyone can hear me.
Fantastic. And you and I are going to take turns kind of muting ourselves so that we don't echo on each other. But I would like to start with just a personal question, if you don't mind, before I hand you the reins to the PowerPoint. You know, I was looking through your slides. I was considering tonight's topic as I thought about the conversation we would have, and you know, it made me realize that many of the individuals and the people that you're talking about are not these long ago, far away actors in the past, right? They're not figures in the pages of a textbook. These are people who lived in my lifetime, at least, and probably for many of the folks in our audience tonight. So I'm curious, Professor Williams, if you could, of those associated with your research and the Black Panther Party, if you could, who would you like to sit down and have a meal with and spend some time with, getting to know and having conversation? Who would you like to meet from this this research that you've done?
Well, fortunately for me, I've met most of them.
That's great.
And so there's very few who I have not met, but and if I could, most of the people I would like to meet have passed away or were assassinated in the period. If I could sit down and pick their brains. But I will say, from the groups that I will introduce today, even though I am passionate about the Panthers, if I was alive 50 years ago, I probably would have been a member of the Black Panther Party, for full disclosure. But they are the most difficult people to deal with, just to be quite honest and frank about it. Young patriots, these Appalachian white migrants, young lords, Puerto Ricans, and others, and folks around the world are wonderful to deal with. But the Panthers are super, super difficult. Various personalities and politics and trauma explain a lot of it, but they're the most difficult people alive to write about. Historians, we usually write about people who have passed on. So they've made my career interesting and tumultuous at the same time.
That's a fantastic framing for tonight's conversation. We appreciate you joining us. We look forward to what the narrative that you'll share with us. Again, as the moderator, I'll be bringing you questions on occasion, but why don't you go ahead and get started, and we look forward to hearing about this story.
Okay. So the title, I'll start there. I always use this photo as an attention getter, just to set the tone for our discussion today and what we're going, primarily because of misconceptions around the party. But I'll come back to this photo later. So keep it in mind. It's a way of open up the Pandora's box around race and what we think race is, typically taught in a binary setting and binary points of views. It's these two individuals, symbols of polar opposite of the racial divisions, especially in our current climate today, for example, are not supposed to get along, but here they are working in coalition and conjunction for various reasons that deals with class and social economic disparities and the like. In chapter 4 of this book, I highlight the original Rainbow Coalition. I don't actually treat them. That's one of the books that I'm writing now. I'm writing too many books at once, 4 to be exact. I need to just focus on one, but that's a conversation for another day. The title of the book is From the Bullet to the Ballot. It's a play on Malcolm X's speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. I reverse it here, meaning the bullet, the Panthers, and the ballot to represent Barack Obama, who was running for president at the time and eventually won the candidacy. It's an examination of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party and racial coalition politics in Chicago over a 50-year period. So ultimately arguing that it's not by accident the first black president comes out of Chicago using racial coalition politics. It was not a new phenomenon. It was actually an organization and ideology that was brought to the mainstream by Fred Hampton, the Black Panther Party, 50 years prior. Their goal was not, of course, to put a black man in the White House, but as historians who document change over time, that's subsequently what happened 50 years later. Next, I'll say something about these films because I rely heavily upon documentaries. So quite quickly, because I don't want to spend too much time on them, the first one, The Black Panthers, Vanguard of Revolution, is one of those Stanley Nelson highly rewarded documentaries. Most of my research prior to the book's publication was used for this documentary. There's about 22 minutes of the documentary, 2 hours long, that focuses on Chicago and Fred Hampton. Almost 95% is due to my research collections and the book that I'll eventually write, which was From the Bullet to the Ballot. In that documentary, and all these films, actually, I don't appear for other reasons, which I'm happy to share, do a question and answer for those who are interested. The second documentary, the first Rainbow Coalition, I think it came out in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, right before the pandemic began. It is a film that was put together by Ray Sastaban. It's primarily featured through PBS at the moment. It is a beginning to end visual representation of the entire book, from the introduction to chapter 6. So if you want a visual representation of From the Bullets to the Ballot, this documentary is so. Again, I don't appear in this documentary either for various reasons, and I'm happy to discuss those during Q&A if necessary as well. And then finally, Judas and the Black Messiah. It is a Warner Brothers film. The scriptwriter, Shaka King, used my book for the script. He used several other books, but he relied on mine the most. I've had conversations with representatives of Warner Brothers and others. What I will say is I do not in any way, shape, or form endorse this film. I can't say the movie is garbage. Therefore, if I do so, I'll be actually saying my book is trash. But Hollywood does what it wants with the history of the past. Fred Hampton is one of our heroes, one of our martyrs of the movement. So he's sacred, much like King and others are. But Hollywood, little old me can't take on big old Warner Brothers. So they did what they wanted to do. This film is not a film or biopic about Fred Hampton. It's actually more of a film about the infiltrator who set up Fred Hampton's assassination. So, and as much as I like folks to go see the film, because most people, majority of Americans do not know who Fred Hampton is. It's a great introduction to who he was, but a lot of it is historically inaccurate. In fact, the Warner Brothers were trying to make a remake of a mob movie that's based in Boston, and that's not what the Panthers are. Defeats the 59 books written about them to dispel these kinds of shoot-'em-up violent episodes that you get in the film. So I don't endorse it. If you're interested, teachers especially, of finding a more accurate history of Fred Hampton, I endorse you to watch the film The Murder of Fred Hampton from 1971 by the Film Group. You can even find it on YouTube for free nowadays. And later when I talk about the Rainbow Coalition documentary entitled American Revolution 2 will be another great film to watch. But I do implore you all to watch them. I just don't endorse Judas and the Black Messiah, even though it did win 2 Oscars and 2 Golden Globes, and there's some great acting in there. So before I jump into the global aspects of the party, which is the purpose of today's topic, I have to start with some basic foundations of the party, some background and some historical context, just to make sure we have a footing here in the States of their importance prior to why folks emulate them around the world. So here you have Bobby Seale on the left and Huey Newton on the right. They are law students at Merritt College. They are migrants. The Black Panther Party and much of the party members that and groups that I introduced you to are migrated from various parts of the nation. Bobby Seale is from Texas. Huey P. Newton's from Louisiana. At least their family are. And in Oakland in 1966, the 2 law students, to try to solve the police brutality that was taking place in their community, but also the social economic disparities, they looked to other groups around the nation to try to figure out what they can emulate or copy or evolve into an organization to solve their issues. And so first they began as trying to recreate or reestablish Malcolm X's Organization of African American Unity, which he was organizing under the leadership and advice of people like Maya Angelou and others prior to his assassination. And then also in the South, you had an organization, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, that was organizing people to vote in Alabama and Mississippi and others. And in Alabama, they created a third political party called the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Alabama. And their symbol was the Confederate flag. Was the Black Panther Party's, the Black Panther symbol. And so these 2 gentlemen, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, reached out to Stokely Carmichael and asked him if he could use that symbol. And he said, of course you can, as long as you advocate on behalf of people and poor people and African Americans, then yes, you can use it. It belongs to the people, not to a particular group. And so they created the Black Panther Party for self-defense. I have to emphasize self-defense. Not the Black Panther Party, we hate white people. It's the Black Panther Party for self-defense. So what do you do when the police are brutalizing you and you have no recourse to deal with it? So they learned the law from the Constitution down to a local municipal code, and they began to police the police and use self-defense as a mantra, not an aggressive way, but as a self-defense way. And I can say a little bit more about that if folks have questions as well. or say something about the relationship to violence and what's considered violence, what isn't, if that is necessary too. So here, let's start with those misconceptions. So the most misconception I hear all the time, thank you, Forrest Gump, that they are the black version of the Ku Klux Klan. But no, they're not. They work with all races. They transcended all those so-called racial differences. They're not the lumpen proletariat, this Marxist term that primarily focuses on criminals and thugs. They're organizers, they're students, veterans, and yes, there are some former gang members. They saw gang members as being terrorists of their community, so they figured if they can politicize them and change their trajectory, they can become particular participants and advocates of their community, and so they do so. Another misconception, there's no women in the group. Well, that's not true. Over 80% of Black Panther Party membership were women, close to 90 actually, were women. They were the only civil rights Black Power group to actually put gender on the front burner along with race and class as a way of solving their community's issues. And they were not trying to overthrow the United States government. They're an anti-capitalist organization. They hated capitalism. They believed that America could not live up to its ideals of a democracy under the capitalist enterprise. So they wanted to keep the democratic process in the democratic political system, but they were in favor of socialism. They wanted a socialist economic system, which is not different from what's taking place around the world. We're having the decolonization movements in the third world international revolutionary proletariat struggle in Africa and the Caribbean and Asia and Latin America. At this time, we actually have a hot war in Vietnam, and people are overthrowing the yoke of colonialism. And most of these countries are not embracing capitalism. They're mostly, almost overwhelmingly embracing socialism. Many of them do keep the democratic processes, but some of them do become communists, hence China and Cuba and some other places. But that's a conversation for another day as well. What's next? So what does it mean to be a member of the Black Panther Party? Can you just get a beret, a leather jacket and gun and walk in off the street and say Black Power? No, it doesn't work that way. First and foremost, you have to spend 6 weeks in the classroom, PE classes, what they call political education, working out your mind. And then you spend 8 hours in a day in that classroom reading these particular books, whether it's Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, Robert Williams, studying international decolonization movements. You're reading Fanon, the Red Book. You're reading John Paul Sartre, Ho Chi Minh, Che Guevara. You're reading all these decolonization movements, what's taking place in South Africa. You learn the law locally and federally. And then you spend the next 8 hours of your day, so 8 hours in the classroom, another 8 hours doing what they would call community service, putting that theory into practice. So there's about 16 hours a day. So think about that. 8 hours in the classroom, 8 hours doing community service. You don't have time to hate white people. There's not enough time in the day, enough energy. You better take the next 8 hours and get some sleep and maybe eat something. So the average age is about 19. They're high school seniors / college freshmen and sophomores transitioning. And they create over 30 particular programs. I don't go over them today, but they're important. So, for example, free breakfast didn't exist before this organization. Free legal aid didn't exist before this organization. Free clinics didn't exist before this organization. They created all these social networks. People were not doing mass testing of sickle cell before this organization. I could keep going on and on and on. And so they created all these particular programs. These survival programs, because they were so effective, the FBI would dub the Panthers the greatest threat to the internal security of the nation. Not because they were advocating armed self-defense, but because these programs were anti-capitalist. They were all free under the guise of socialism to bring various necessary commitments and ways of solving those socioeconomic dilemmas of self-determination to all communities. And so as I transition from there, I want to introduce you to some of these folks. So the original Rainbow Coalition is founded in Chicago. So the Black Panther Party as a national headquarters is established in Oakland, California in 1966. The Illinois chapter of the party is established in Chicago in November of 1968. And one of the things that they create out of that Illinois chapter is the Rainbow Coalition. Now, racial coalition politics is a mantra of the national headquarters in Oakland. So the Panthers in Illinois didn't invent this. It's part of the national ideology. But Chicago is different because Chicago is the most racially, residentially segregated city in America. Still is today. It gets worse with each census record. So here we have another migrant, Bob Lee, this black man named Robert E. Lee III. He's not named after Confederate general. He's named after his grandfather, ironically, who was one of the key pillars of Longshoremen's Union in Galveston, Texas, where he's from, in Houston. And he moved to Chicago, on the north side of Chicago, and he begins to organize amongst these another group of migrants, these poor white migrants, these Confederate flag Southern white migrants who moved to Chicago as well from the south, from the foothills of West Virginia, all the way down to Alabama, looking for economic opportunities. So he's one of the critical creators of the original Rainbow Coalition. So he and Fred Hampton meet in secret to create this organization. So who are they? Typically, when we think of the Rainbow Coalition, we think of Jesse Jackson. Had nothing to do with this organization. In fact, Jesse Jackson appropriated the term from this group. So the Panthers are the creators, led by Bob Lee and Fred Hampton. And Bob Lee brings in the Young Patriots, who are, again, these Confederate flag Southern white migrants from various parts of Appalachia on the north side of Chicago in this community called Uptown. Then you have the Young Lords. These are Puerto Ricans from the island of Puerto Rico and along the East Coast who moved to Chicago as well, another migration history, looking for economic opportunities during this time, led by Jose Chacha Jiminez. And Young Lords at this time is actually a gang, and because of the influence of the activism around the Democratic National Convention and the influence of Fred Hampton himself in the Black Panther Party, they formed this organization called the Young Lords Organization, and together those three groups make up the original Rainbow Coalition. Now, this final group, Rise Up Angry, they're not one of the original Rainbow Coalition organizations, but they work in coalition with them. They're primarily young greasers, anti-war, part of the student movement who moved from various parts of the country, primarily the West Coast, and they form an organization in Chicago around the DNC, end up staying, and they call themselves Rise Up Angry. So this group makes up the Rainbow Coalition. Again, no Jesse Jackson. And just to let you see what some of them look like, here's Bill Preacherman Freshman. He's actually from North Carolina. And he's, if I'm not mistaken, he's still alive, but that's a conversation for another day. He doesn't like to talk about the past. As you can see, it's Confederate flag, but he's one of the founding members of the Young Patriots. Here's Jose Chacha Jiminez, probably the person I spend the most time with when studying this organization. He's leader of the Young Lords organization, which will become the Young Lords Party in New York, but I can answer those questions if necessary as well. And Mike Daines from Rise Up Angry, and who's still part of the political progressive wings of the Democratic Party in Chicago to this day. And Fred Hampton, who is, in my opinion, the most important political figure in the 20th century that very few people have heard about. Maybe more have now because of the Warner Brothers film. He is a middle-class kid from Maywood. He's actually not from Chicago. He's from the suburbs. He is, at the time, he's recruited into the Black Panther Party. He is chairman of the NAACP Youth Council. He is studying law at Triton College, and various members of the Illinois chapter, Bobby Rush and others who I introduced to you in a second, recruits him into the organization because he's just a phenomenal orator and a key critical thinker and a major organizer of youth and movements of the period in the suburbs of Maywood around these particular issues. So the Illinois chapter of the party is established again in November of 68, and it makes them different is they're a state chapter. They're not a city chapter. So there's about 51 chapters of the Black Panther Party, beginning in Oakland, in cities. Like, for example, Indianapolis has one. There was one in Wilmington, North Carolina, for example. There's city chapters. But Chicago, the state chapter, which was quite different, meaning they had branches on almost every major campus throughout the state of Illinois, and Chicago was its headquarters. So they're the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, not the Chicago chapter. So every major college campus had a chapter. So whoever was the head of the Black Student Union, typically on that college campus, was most likely head of the Black Panther Party as well, because they're students. They're part of the student movement that's taking place. And usually when we talk about the student movement, we forget that African Americans are very much involved in that. And the creation of Black Studies comes out of that. Africana Studies is a discipline, part of that student movement. And the Panthers and these groups throughout Illinois, for example, are very much part of that. 2 more slides before I stop to field some questions if you have them. So the Panthers, when they create the original Rainbow Coalition in Chicago, the Rainbow Coalition Chicago phenomenon head of those organizations. People forget that when King was assassinated in '68, he was leading what he calls the Poor People's Campaign, this march on Washington against capitalism, what he called materialism. King, in his later years, will become a democratic socialist, and he's assassinated, taking on a capitalist structure. So the Panthers see themselves very much in King's light and continuing that kinds of human rights advocacy. So here in this press conference, it is 1 year to the day of of Martin Luther King's assassination, April 4th, 1969, and the groups come together to announce to the world no longer will they let the capitalist enterprise divide and conquer them by race. They're going to transcend those racial differences in the spirit of King and form this nexus called of class solidarity on behalf of what they all have in common, which is their poverty. So on your far left, you'll see the Young Patriots. That's Bill Preacher Fesserman with that Confederate flag on his beret. In the middle is Rise Up Angry. The two black men in the middle are the Panthers. The one standing with glasses is the Illinois chapter party founder and actual leader of the chapter of the chapter, Bobby Rush, now U.S. Congressman Bobby Rush, who's retiring soon. He's been a congressman over 30 years. And the two gentlemen, Fredo and Louis Cuzo on the far right, are members of the Young Lords, again making up the original Rainbow Coalition. No Jesse Jackson. So just imagine these two. Come back to this photo prior to me pausing. Walking into the room and assuming we're all in that room. And that racist Confederate flag and this brother with his unapologetically black power symbols, his black fist, his leather jacket and beret. And they're holding hands and clutching arms and arguing that they're brothers of the struggle. They're arguing and advocating for us in the room to look past those so-called differences and unite on what they have in common. One, their humanity, and two, their poverty. And so how does this happen? The Panthers have programs, all these various community service programs they create, and they go into all these various communities, poor whites, Latino, Native American, doesn't matter. And they teach these folks how to run the same programs that they have. And so what the Panthers will go in these communities and do, particularly Bob Lee, who's one of the key movers and shakers, he'll say, let's ignore our particular skin color. It's not what we have in common. You have poverty in your community? Well, so do we. You have health care? No? Well, neither do African Americans. Are you being drafted to Vietnam? Well, so are we. Are the police brutalizing you? Well, the same thing has happened to us. Do you have dilapidated schools? Well, so do we. What about your houses, your homes? You have rats and roaches? Well, we do too. Well, why do we hate each other again? Because you're black and we're white? That's stupid. Let's unite on what we actually have in common, our poverty, and let's look at the common denominator of our poverty, which is capitalism. And they began to form this socialist organization called the original Rainbow Coalition. And that coalition only holds together because the Panthers have programs that work. So they teach these groups how to operate free breakfast programs, free clinics, and all these various mechanisms. And what makes Illinois so spectacular in this is the Panthers are able to convince the Cook County Health Commissioner, Quentin Young, to head all of these clinics. And so when you go into their free clinics, you have residents from the University of Chicago or Northwestern, some of the top medical schools in the country. They have to do their residency somewhere. They're doing them in these clinics. So you get to see a gynecologist, a pediatrician, and whatever you need, right? The ambulance, medication, and these exams for free. And it's run by the Cook County Health Commission. So the Panthers are revolutionizing social services in all these various ways, and these programs is why the glue work. It's too easy to say you're black and I'm white and we should work together. What's more tangible is we have programs that can help solve some of the critical issues that plague your community, and they actually work. And because of those programs, you have this coalition. And because of those programs, again, the federal government, J. Edgar Hoover and FBI, does the Panthers the greatest threat to the internal security of the nation. And as a result, all these various groups around the nation begin to emulate the Panthers and copy them. They copy their 10-point platform. They copy their self-defense ideology. They copy their community service survivor programs. They work in coalition with others. And you can see they run the gamut across the racial lines. Now, the Panthers are very possessive about who gets to use their name. They don't let anybody use their name because folks can go out and commit some kind of heinous act and then say the Panthers did it. And so they're very possessive. There's only one group that got away with that. That's the White Panther Party in Dearborn, Michigan. And quite honest, those white guys just have more guns than the Panthers. But so you get groups like the Iroquois, the Chinese Red Guard, and others. You can read this list from white, Latino, Asian American, Native American, others who all emulate the party. And there's many, many more. And because of that emulation, people around not just in the country, but what I call domestically, but also abroad across the world begins to emulate them as well. So I'll pause here before I go global, just in case you have some questions you'd like me to field. I know I'm speaking kind of fast here.
You know, we do have a bunch of questions that have queued up, Professor, so let me do these one at a time. Let me start with this question from Sundina, who is joining us from, Sundina is a middle grades teacher in Los Angeles Unified, and she's wondering if there are instances where the Young Patriots changed their stance on racial differences from being a part of the Rainbow Coalition, referencing in particular the individual of that flag.
Yeah, so the Confederate flag is always a contention getter. So if I go back, which I won't, but if I go back and show you the cover of my book, you won't see it there, right? You'll see the cover of my book has the Rainbow Coalition members hanging out, smoking cigarette, having to chat at one of the rallies, but no Confederate flag. I don't want to mislead people, so I deliberately do not use it on the cover of the book. However, yes, it's hard to work a coalition with these people that crosses all these various racial lines, continue to have the same kind of connotations and affiliation that most people who use the Confederate flag today still have. So eventually, Young Patriots will abandon that symbol. But the Panthers encouraged them to keep it at that time because they're trying to bring people into the fold. So let me back up and explain this. So all the racial baggage that comes along with that racist symbol, a lot of members of the party were uncomfortable with that. So the Panthers had to make tough decisions. So they purged a lot of people out of the party for their unwillingness to look past that symbol. And people were subsequently eliminated from the organization. And so what the Panthers would do is go around the country. Bob Lee and Bill Pritchard Fesserman together, this black man named Robert Lee III, and this Southerner from North Carolina with this Confederate flag, and they would travel the country, but get primarily in the South, to organize Rainbow Coalition chapters around the country. And so they used that symbol as a way of bringing people in to have these real, honest conversations about it. But as an organization, the Young Patriots distanced themselves from that symbol. They also came to recognize it as a sense of a sign of oppression, of racial animosity. In their own words, they will argue that as Southerners, they know what it feels to beat down people. And now moving to Chicago, they know what it feels to be beat down because most of the people who were brutalized in them in the North, the Young Patriots, were white, calling them white trash and hillbillies and some of these other derogatory terms, which is why the Panthers joined forces with them. So ironically, when Bob Lee meets them, they're organizing at this church called the Church of Three Crosses, and the Patriots are defending themselves from a very hostile, predominantly white crowd. And Bob Lee comes to their defense, and that's how they begin to form these bonds. And yes, they found it ironic and funny that this black man named Robert Lee, that also alleviated some of the racial tension. But the symbol was used for political reasons, but in the long run, and today I still work with many of these folks. Hy Thurman, who still lives in Huntsville, Alabama, and some of these folks I still work with, they don't use that flag anymore. They oppose it. But they came to those terms on their own. The Panthers didn't force them to. But it's hard to work in coalition on behalf of humanity and human rights and still have some of those racist connotations, symbols as a part of the organization. And then they integrated the organization. So there was a lot of Latinos who joined the Young Patriots, people from Cuba and various other parts of the globe, some African Americans who joined the organization. And the current organization is still alive in places like Huntsville, Alabama. You have this coalition, if you will, of people who call themselves Young Patriots. And so it's very much a political ploy why they did so.
Great, thank you. So here's the next question, and Jacoby, why don't you mute yourself, and then I'll ask it, and we can trade the mutes. There you go. Thank you. So Erica, who is joining us from Concord, California, noticed early on in your talk tonight that she's drawing a connection between the ways that Hollywood portrayed Judas and the Black Messiah and the comments you made about it in terms of being inaccurate and being sort of crafted by the needs and the goals of Hollywood. She made a connection between that and how the media portrayed the Black Panthers back in the 1960s. Can you speak a little bit to the media portrayal of the Black Panthers?
Yes. So it's a catch-22 in the media portrayal of the party. So you have to imagine, I was trying to paint a picture for you. The Panthers were not well known. It was not until May of 1967 when the Panthers stormed the California state legislature armed. Then Governor Ronald Reagan, later President Ronald Reagan, you can see him running for his life across the state capitol lawn. The Panthers were not after him. And they were there to protest a bill called the Mumford Bill, which was put in the state legislature to disarm them because they were policing the police. And it was also, the bill was ironically co-sponsored by the NRA. They didn't want these black men to arm themselves. When we think about our current context about the NRA. And at that protest, Bobby Seale reads Executive Mandate Number 1, which criticizes the hypocrisy of American democracy, the way in which this bill is a affront against the Second Amendment right to bear arms and right for humans to defend themselves. And that image is blasted not just nationally, but internationally. So it's not until that media portrayal that the Black Panther becomes this national phenomenon. So, for example, the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party only started because they saw that image. Without that image, there would be no need. So folks around the country saw it and began to want to form chapters, and people flooded into the offices. At the same time, you had folks like, not to belittle Walter Cronkite and others, you had, in chapter 5 of the book, I write about the media in this regard. You had the media planning false stories about this organization, call them terrorists, militants, killers, murderers, and anything you could think of derogatory to prevent people from joining forces with them. Now, what we don't know in our current context, unless you read some of the many books that have been written about this, is that most of these people that we respect as journalists were working as propagandists on behalf of the state. We are in a Cold War. At the same time we're in this Cold War, there's a hot war in Vietnam. We're losing. And so these journalists saw themselves doing their patriotic duty by painting the Panthers in this negative light. Irony in that is the Panthers had a newspaper to combat that. We get most of our, then in that period, we had most of our information from newspapers. All these groups had newspapers. The Panthers, Young Patriots, Young Loyalists, and others. And then the Panthers were very charismatic because they spent 8 hours or more a day in the classroom. And so when they're on these interviews on television and radios, they're able to hold their own to dispel a lot of myths. So the Panthers spend a lot of time publishing their papers and sitting for interviews on radio and television to dispel misconceptions and argue against a lot of the false propaganda that was being put out by the media. And so in chapter 5, I take a deep dive into who these people are, and I name most of them. Chicago Tribune, for example, is notorious. They're paid by the United States government and the daily Democratic machine in Chicago to masquerade as journalism when it's really propaganda on behalf of the state, because we are losing the Cold War, hearts and minds. At the same time, we're losing the hot war in Vietnam, just to try to rationalize the patriotism of those journalists. So I name who some of them are and why they're doing it. And so there's a misconception that the Panthers are a media-born organization because everyone wants to put a camera in their face because they're so provocative, right? They're always cursing, they're confrontational. It's a way of capturing the imagination of the masses, which is their intention, but also gives them a chance to spout their positions and their ideology to bring people into the fold. So they want a revolution, and don't get me wrong, the Panthers are revolutionary, and they believe that they are part of an international, global, third world revolutionary proletariat struggle. So they want a revolution in the United States to overthrow capitalism. But they realize that if they go at it alone, then they would be exactly what the media and others are painting them out to be, terrorists. And so what they do is highlight the contradictions. They use their survival programs. It's called Survival Pending Revolution programs, and train all people, regardless of race, to transcend those racial differences, to solve some of these economic disparities with the hope that the people themselves, Americans themselves, will demand a revolution, and then the Panthers will take on the leadership of that revolution as the vanguard, hence the vanguard of the movement, and then lead that revolution. And so they use their paper, they use the survival programs, they use the media in all these various ways. The media is using them, but at the same time, the Panthers are also using the media. And so it's a odd quid pro quo at play, if that makes sense, of the way in which this the internal faction and of the media apparatus, and then the political propaganda of the Panthers themselves are all being exploited on both sides for various reasons, and so they're both using each other. And so that's the best way to, I guess, to talk about the media. But I do write about this in chapter 5 in the way in which the media uses propaganda, not journalism, which is not what we're supposed to do, right? This is the Cold War. We're arguing that's what the communists do, not what we do in a democracy, but no, we do it as well. And so I name who these people are and who these papers are. You could go read Frank Donner and some of these other folks who've written more exclusively about this. Frank Donner from the ACLU in that period wrote 3 or 4 books about the way in which the media and newspapers were advocating on behalf of the state and local and state governments.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's a really comprehensive answer, and I appreciate Erica drawing that connection and you then fleshing it out. One more question, perhaps, before we move on. This comes from Tisha. Tisha's, again, joining us from Hopkins School in Connecticut. Professor, go ahead and mute yourself for me, and I'll read this question.
I'm sorry.
Thanks. That's okay. First of all, Tisha wants to thank you for such an interesting talk. In these contentious times, it seems that the Black Panther Party's original Rainbow Coalition provides an invaluable model. What do you think are the lessons that the BPP provide in coalition building for us today?
Great question. I get that question all the time because as an activist scholar, I'm very involved in many of these movements. And so the Rainbow Coalition ideology is alive and well today. We have a lot of misconceptions about them. So, for example, Black Lives Matter. People like to, on the right or conservatives, equate them with Black Power or even the Black Panthers in some ways. But like the Panthers in this period in the Rainbow Coalition, it's a coalition of folks. I've yet to go to a Black Lives Matter rally and not be outnumbered by non-Black participants. It happens all the time. So if you're looking for examples of what that looks like, the Black Lives Matter would be one. Black Lives Matter is now a brick and mortar organization. So you have 2 factions of it. You have that faction, but you also have Black Lives Matter, the network. That's the Movement for Black Lives. If you go to movementforblacklaves.org and look at the platform that they put together along with myself and a whole host of other scholars who have helped them, it mirrors quite starkly the Black Panther Party's 10-point platform, right? The same issues that were plaguing African Americans in that period are plaguing us today. Poverty, healthcare, housing, unemployment, the list goes on, with some new things like HIV/AIDS that didn't exist then, or mass incarceration, crack cocaine, some of these new phenomena, but some of the same issues. But if you're looking for a mirror image of the Rainbow Coalition today, look no further than Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign. That's where I got started. When I was at the National Humanities Center, my time there, Reverend Barber was having Moral Mondays in North Carolina, fighting against the bathroom bills and others. And so he was recruited into a larger entity, which now is the New Poor People's Campaign, led by he and Reverend Theo Harris. And so they're a mirror image of what King's Poor People's Campaign was then. They're a mirror image of what the Panthers Rainbow Coalition was then. Today, fighting for those same issues against housing, unemployment, health disparities, voting, some of the same issues that plagued communities then still plague them now. And so you can find them alive and well today. So I often point to those two because students always want to start something. And I have to remind them. It's the same conversation I had with my fellows when I was at the National Humanities Center. This is when I was there when Trump was elected. That was a very depressing night, that November night. We watched that on the news together. And folks were charged, my fellow fellows were charged up and wanted to join something. So like them and like students today, I have to remind them, all you have to do is join something. I'm starting anything new. African Americans have been advocating on behalf of these issues for generations. And so just join what we have. We need more people who are willing to do the hard work. And so the New Poor People's Campaign, led by Reverend Barber, and the Movement for Black Lives, which is a network of many different organizations, kind of like the Rainbow Coalition, kind of like this list that you see here on the screen. All these groups can make up the Movement for Black Lives today, for example, the Peace and Freedom Party, the American Indian Movement, and so forth. And then you have an organization that's Black Lives Matter that has officers and presidents. They've taken on a whole different connotation now. But you can find those examples today. And within the organization, the Movement for Black Lives, with all those different organizations, just to name a few of them, right? You have people like Black Youth Project out of Chicago, who began as students sitting in the classroom at the University of Chicago and decided that these young ladies are going to do something about it. The only difference between the past and today, which I need to highlight, I'd be remiss if I did so, is women have always been the backbone of all these movements. I don't care what period you choose, civil rights, Black Power, doesn't matter. Women are the backbone. In the Black Panther Party, they make up over 80% of the population or the membership. Well, today the difference is women are the leaders of these movements. Before they were just in them and the backbone, but now they're actually out front and leading. So that's the huge difference today. If you look at most of these organizations that form the Movement for Black Lives, from Asada's Daughters to We Charge Genocide to Dream Defenders, and the list goes on. Most of them are led by women and queer women on top of that. And so there's some more connection to the Panthers there as well, because they were the only organization that advocated on behalf of LGBTQ plus issues too during that period. So they're very, very progressive.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, and in particular referencing your work with Reverend Barber when you were in North Carolina. I've got one more question for you, and then we should probably move on so we can meet our 8:30 conclusion time. This question actually comes from what seems to be a former student of yours. Robert is joining us from the Bank Street School of Education in New York City, Robert Gottlieb, and he says he misses your class, Professor Williams, and he asks for this webinar, which activist group today do you think is genuinely demanding a revolution themselves, as opposed to how they are portrayed in the media or by their critics?
Well, that's a tough one. Revolution. I'm a pessimist. So we have a number of groups who are advocating for revolution in a different way. So even Black Youth Project and others who are leading campaigns like Defund the Police as a mantra. Groups with activist scholars involved like Angela Davis and others who are calling for abolition of prisons. These are revolutionary ideas and methodologies. But in the way in which the Panthers are advocating for, I'm a bit torn in highlighting some of those groups, because I understand why they exist, but at the same time, some of those groups have problems. They're gonna get somebody killed. For example, we can take the new Black Panther Party. I can't throw them under the bus because I understand why they exist. Many of the crazy issues that, like police murdering African-American citizens and Black and brown citizens, is still a critical issue. We all saw what happened to George Floyd. But you can't put a white piece of paper in front of this organization. They had everything white, and that's just not what the Black Panther Party was about. So you have all these various organizations that have good tendencies, but then there are other problems too. As a historian, a lot of my critique of many of these groups that are revolutionary, that can do good work, they don't study anything. You can say what you want about the Panthers. They sat in the classroom for 8 hours a day. They knew why they were doing what they were doing. And most of these groups today, they don't read. They don't turn to the past. They think they're reinventing something, or they're onto something. Kind of similar to my critique of my students and fellows back in 2016 when I said just join something. These folks haven't read much. And so you have a number of organizations that may fit the bill, but I'm hesitant to call them out, because I'd be remiss if someone joined one of these organizations and something negative happened. And I'm just not convinced that the state isn't repressing these organizations the way in which COINTELPRO and from the federal government level and the Red Squad from the local level repressed and assassinated and exiled and murdered various forms people in the past, like Fred Hampton and other forms of the Panthers. Today, we do that surveillance and infiltration for the police themselves, right? Every device in our hand has a microphone on it. We don't know who's listening to us. We put everything that we do on the internet, right? I'm eating at this restaurant, I'm going to this rally, we taking pictures and posting on the internet with our location attached to it. So we're doing the work of surveilling the state, of surveilling ourselves for the state. And so many of these groups who have revolutionary tendencies don't have a lot of security in mind for that. That's why the Panthers don't exist anymore now. They never thought that they believe that if they stay within the bounds of legality, they know the law, stay within the law, and not break the law, that they'd be safe. No, the government still murdered them, killed them, exiled them, false imprisoned them. The government that broke the law, locally and federally. And so none of that is passed now, especially with the Patriot Act. So I'm very hesitant to call out any of those organizations just because former students like you and others may be interested in, I don't want to have your blood or imprisonment on my hands, because I just don't trust many of these groups.
Excellent. Thank you for the question, Robert, and thank you for that very, very candid response, Professor. Let's go ahead and move forward now. We can start talking more about the global influence. We've got about 35 minutes before we conclude.
Okay. Well, you see all those groups on the domestic front. I won't go over all of them because we just don't have enough time, but I will introduce you to a few of them. Here on the global front, you have all these places, and I primarily focus on continents more than, I guess, or large bodies more than just particular countries, but I'll get to those specific countries in a second. But all these areas, these regions of the globe have established a form of the Black Panther Party or emulated them in some way, shape, or form. They're everywhere, is what I'm trying to illustrate. There's very few places that's untouched, unless you're in the Galapagos or Antarctica somewhere. But you have these organizations everywhere. And so I'm going to introduce you to a few of them. Now, thanks to, and I maybe should have given them a shout out earlier, the archivists there at the National Humanities Center, Brooke and Sarah, I think they may still be there. A lot of this work that came from them. The archivists there I'm still singing hugs and kisses to them. They told me to give them my most egregious assignments and let them go find it. And I gave them stuff that I was trying to find for almost 10, 20 years. And they found it in a matter of hours. I can't make this stuff up. So some of what I'm sharing with you today is because of the great work of the archivists there at the National Humanities Center. So I have to give them big credit. So here, I start here in Britain, the British Black Panther Party. They were actually the first organization to emulate the Panthers. Now, what makes them so special is, remember, the Panthers began in Oakland in 1966, and it's not until May of 1967 that the national, the communities like Chicago and others are introduced to the party because of that march on the California State Legislature to protest the Mumford Bill. So the Panthers haven't moved out of Oakland yet. And once those images are portrayed throughout the nation, but internationally, the first group to form a Panther Party was in Britain, in Brixton, in London, ironically. So way before the Panthers in Illinois now established in 1968. So the British Black Panther Party was established in 1967, and they lasted about 1972, part of this larger Black Power movement in London. It's founded primarily by Africans and folks who are Afro-Caribbean migrants, but in the party themselves, these folks make up folks from all across the world. Members consist of people from Barbados, Great Britain itself, many Europeans, China, Colombia, Cuba, Germany, Ghana, Jamaica, Nigeria, Pakistan, India, the Philippines, Poland, Somalia, Thailand, Turkey. Basically, they were the colonial subjects of the British Empire. So here's Farouk Dandi, for example. He was a university student at Cambridge, and he's from India. He's the Minister of Information, one of the founders, longest tenured members of the British Black Panther Party. And so I'm intrigued by the book that I'm writing. I'm intrigued by those folks who are emulating the party, who call themselves the Black Panther Party, and most of these people aren't black. So I'm interested in the places where the Panthers did not go, right? So they went to the Caribbean, they went to Africa, even went to China. So I ignored some of these places. I'm interested in where these folks had no connection to the Panthers, and in some places I had no connection to African Americans or people of African descent at all, but it's decided to emulate the party, and not just emulate them, but also call themselves black in all these various ways. So just to be frank about, as an African American, a lot of people want to be us, but a lot of them don't want to be us. And so I want to go see who these people are and why. And so I've been able to sit down and interview and spend a lot of time with these folks. So here, for example, is a copy of the British Black Panther Party news service where they emulate images from the party. So that right figure in the right top corner is Erica Huggins, a member of the Oakland chapter. They have the Panther symbol in the middle of the party. That guy on the left is Bunty Carter, and some of these other members of the Black Panther Party. And just like just like Oakland, they're dealing with police brutality. If you read the blurb there about the racist pig police attacks on black people and so forth and so on. So what I'm realizing in writing this book is that what the Panthers and the Rainbow Coalition is arguing as well is that police brutality and poverty and oppression is a global phenomenon that just was taking place in Oakland or Chicago on the domestic front. So then my travels took me to New Zealand and the Polynesian Panthers. They're established in about 1971. They last for about 10 years. They're made up of primarily the Maori. These are folks who are indigenous to New Zealand, along with other indigenous groups from around the South Pacific Islands there in New Zealand. And they organize against what they would call the Pelagi, these these foreigners who are not native to the South Pacific. And they fought state power on behalf of all Pacific people who face racism and colonialism, and they emulated the Black Panther Party. I mean, look at this brother here on the right. Doesn't it look like U.P. Newton walking there? They emulate the iconography and all. And so typically when I have more time, I break these groups down in more robust ways. But I'll say a little bit about them in a second in the summary. But I just want to at least introduce you to them, highlight who they are as quickly as possible. And then the Ballot Panthers. So my travels took me to India. The Ballot Panthers are formed also in what was then Bombay, which is in now present-day Mumbai, in 1972. The Ballot Panthers. There's not a class movement, it's a caste issue. And so I had to learn about all of this. So I have all these documents. I had no idea how many languages were spoken in India, and I do now. I'm a U.S. trained historian, so I have all these various documents and material and ephemeral and all these numerous languages that I have to get transcribed and figure out. But I have it. But here, this organization, and at least in these pictures, they argue that they are commemorating what they call Black Independence Day. And they create, the Dalits are the lowest of the caste in that system. And they say that due to the hideous plot of American imperialism, the third Dalit world and all oppressed nations and Dalit people who are suffering, especially in India, even in America, and a handful of reactionary whites they believe are exploiting blacks, that to meet the force of reaction and remove this exploitation, that the Black Panther movement grew in India. And the Black Panther movement and Black Power emerged in India, and they claim a close relationship with the global Black Power struggle. So I find all this to be quite interesting. So some of these people, ironically, this organization is still around today. In fact, their 50th anniversary is this year, the Golden Jubilee. I actually gave 3 different interviews over this past weekend, in various news programs about the 50th anniversary Golden Jubilee. I'll be there in May to celebrate with the 3 founders. But this gentleman here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but because I don't have a click or anything, his name is Ram Das Atawale, and he's not involved in the organization anymore. Many of them have gone on from these progressive revolutionary ideologies into neocons who are in government, who are part of the oppressive regime in the Modi administration and others, but I can speak about them in more detailed question and answer if necessary. Then my travels take me to the Israeli Black Panther Party. And again, except for the Dalits and Polynesians, but some of these folks do call themselves Black Panthers. So I had to go to Israel. This was actually when I was at the National Humanity Center. And that the last 2 weeks I had to cut short because I was invited to come to Israel and Palestine. Well, I was trying to get to Palestine. I just couldn't tell the Israeli government that. They didn't want to let me in. But here what I found out is there were a contingent of Mizrahi Jews, these Jews from Arab lands who challenged Ashkenazi Jews for equal rights. And they were advocating on behalf of being oppressed and brutalized by various regimes, and they even support the Palestinian struggle. So what makes them interesting is the way in which they find out about the Black Panther Party. There is an American GI who goes AWOL during Vietnam, and he, of all places to hide out, he's hiding out in Israel. And he brings all this opium and all these various drugs from Southeast Asia with him. And he's sitting around with these Mizrahi Jews, and they're looking for some paper to smoke their dope, quite honest about it. And he has a copy of the Black Panther newspaper. So they're about to tear the paper up to roll what they're going to roll in the smoke. And they begin to read it and say, wait a minute, there's something to this. they're talking about some of the same issues that we are, and that's how they were introduced to the Black Panther Party. Now, there's some meetings between some of these other organizations, like the Palestinian Panther Party. This is one of the few organizations who began to form a coalition with the party. This is one of the pictures that I took on that trip that year. I've been back maybe 4 times, but this is one of the first photos that I took. Here is one of the few contingents where the Panthers and Palestinians actually meet. There's a long history of solidarity with Palestine and the Black Panther Party. The Palestinian Panthers are created in the late 1980s, to give you some historical context. If I go back, the Israeli Black Panther Party lasted from 71 to 77. Palestinians emulated the Panthers in the late 1980s, around the Second Intifada, so we can talk about that as well. The party in Palestine issued at least 3, the Panthers issued at least 3 official statements on Palestine in their newspapers, talking about the Middle East in 1970, 1974, and 1980. But their solidarity began with George Jackson. He was a political prisoner in Soledad. If you know anything about the Angela Davis story, you should be familiar with George Jackson. So the solidarity was solidified due to the connection established between George and a Palestinian prisoner and the global struggle for prisoner rights. So this is a professor named Greg Thomas, who teaches at Tufts. He curated this archive here at this museum in Al-Quds in Palestine, where you can see the representation of these prison letters between George and Samir al-Qasim, and that introduction creates the need of creating an armed wing of the Palestinian revolutionary movement, and they call themselves the Palestinian Panthers. So they are the only ones who actually pick up the gun. And this next group, the Australian Black Panther Party, they're also the only ones who are interested in the gun. So I can talk about all these groups in a nutshell. I'll just make a quick caveat so I don't forget my point, and I'll come back to the Australians. But all these groups emulate the Panthers because of their racial coalition politics and because of their community survival programs. Nobody's infatuated with the gun. That's very much an American phenomenon. In fact, I get invited to speak all over the world in these various places because people want to know why we're so infatuated with the Second Amendment and gun rights. But this Australians and the Palestinians because they have a different kind of connotation, right? They're at war, so to speak, over land with Israel. And then here, the Panthers, the Aborigines, are the only other advocates who want to arm themselves. They don't get a chance to, but they're very much interested in doing so. So here you see Dennis Walker and Sam Watson, these co-founders of the Australian Black Panther Party, and they declared the BPP to be the vanguard, of all depressed people. And in Australia, they believe the Aborigines were the most depressed of all. And so the Panthers there in Australia were headquarters in Brisbane. They advocated for equality in education, health, legal representation, the abolition of discriminatory legislation, end of police brutality, some of the same things folks were fighting for in the States. And then they advocated primarily on behalf of the original people of the land as well. And so I could talk about more of that in Q&A too. I'm just going over this quickly so I can have more of a conversation with you all. And maybe I end here with La Pantera in Italy. So La Pantera formed in 1989. They're one of the last groups to form after the Palestinians. The Palestinian Black Panther Party were wiped out by British troops. Well, that's a conversation we can have another day as well. But in Italy, this group formed an opposition to the Gelmini Education Reform Bill. And so in 89 was also the year Huey P. Newton was killed and passed away. And so they picked up the mantra in honor of Huey P. Newton, but also as a way of protesting against this education reform bill. So they succeeded in blocking the plan, and they gave birth to this new movement that moved into the 90s, and they formed a group called what they would call La Pantera, the Panther, in that regard, and they began to advocate on behalf of student movement and student rights. Now, like the Panthers in the States and all those other groups that emulated them, everyone had a newspaper. Everyone had papers. But all these groups did as well, many of which, thanks to, again, Brooke and Sarah and others, I was able to get my hands on a lot of this stuff while I was there at the National Humanities Center. But what made La Pantera so, I guess, revolutionary in a different way was that everyone else was using menial presses and others of producing their papers, where the La Pantera used this new advent in technology at the time called the fax machine. And so they just faxed telegrams and newsletters to people all around the country in various parts of the globe and so forth and so on. And I end there, just in case you have any questions. I know I went through that pretty quickly, but just to highlight some of the organizations, some of the people around the world who emulate them. And again, I only focus on these groups, the groups that had no direct connection to the Panthers, and in some cases no direct connection to African Americans in some ways, but decided to emulate the Panthers to resolve their own issues of social inequality and political oppression, police brutality, land grabs, and the list goes on. Some of the same issues that folks in the States were dealing with. And so they also see themselves as part of this international revolutionary, third world revolutionary struggle that takes a different form. We get to the 80s, like with Palestinians and Italy and others. They have different movements. The revolution isn't on anymore. Folks really think there is a revolution in the 60s and 70s. There can be one, not just in the States, but worldwide. The revolutions are happening. But in the 80s, it's a different kind of trajectory. The Cold War is winding down. Americans end up winning that long, protracted struggle. And all these organizations have one thing in common, that instead of picking a group like the NAACP or King's SCLC or any of these other organizations, African American organizations in the States, Urban League, anybody, they choose the Black Panther Party to emulate. And again, it's primarily because of their racial coalition politics, their ideology, the democratic socialist position, and they have programs of self-determination that work, that they can train each other in their communities to form these kinds of bonds to advocate on behalf of what they all need and form these auspices of solidarity. So I end there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor. I do have a lot of questions that have queued up, so I'd like to go through these one at a time. We've got plenty of time for you to respond extemporaneously and sort of do a deeper dive in some of these topics. The first one comes from Michael Williams. There you go, same last name as yours. Michael's a retired bookstore owner in Charlottesville, Virginia. And he's wondering if there are any places in the globe that you anticipated finding these connections, and then you were surprised that you didn't.
Great question. Yes and no. So that the jury is still out. So I can't say there are any, because through the pandemic, I had to cancel several trips. So in the beginning of February, at that time, I was actually February 2020. That's when I was in fights with Warner Brothers over this film. Ended up coming out a year later. But the pandemic started then. Really took off. Schools began to close on campuses in February of 2020. Then March, it really heated up. I was on sabbatical. I was scheduled to go to 9 different countries that year, and I've yet to get there. Russia is one. Portugal. Not to keep naming all these places, but there's a number of places I'm still hoping to get to this summer. So I've yet to travel. So I've been to 40 plus places prior to the pandemic, but I haven't gotten to these places yet. So I can't really answer that question yet. I'm hoping there's something there. I'm hoping there's a there. But I don't know until I actually get my hands on some of the material. Via Zoom, via various email exchanges, I'm being able to get my hands on some papers and things of that nature. But until I can actually conduct a thorough investigation and do some interviews, I really don't know. But I was surprised to find locations like Italy or Israel. I was invited to Israel because I was trying to go to Palestine. And then I spent about 4 days with Reuben Abergal, one of the founders of the Israeli Black Panther Party. I know he hates to see me coming because I always hold him hostage for days on end because he's just so profound. And just tell me more. And I can't speak Hebrew, so I got all these interviews that I have to get translated and transcribed and to deal with all these various. So there's been surprises. So I'm suspecting there are going to be some in Russia, some in Switzerland and Sweden, some in Portugal and Spain and some of these other places I've yet to get to that's on my list. But I do want to go to Africa because I do know there were connections in Africa and the Caribbean that I haven't gotten to yet. But the Panthers actually went there, right? The international section the Black Panther Party's headquarters was in Algeria. And then the Algerian government had given their embassy over to them. I'm sorry, the Vietnamese government had given their embassy over to Eldridge and Kathleen so they can form a Black Panther Party so-called embassy. So people from around the globe came to visit them. And so there's papers there too that I haven't got to in Algeria. So I have another places I need to get to. So I can come back to that question once I'm able to travel again.
We'll do another webinar in a few years. Thank you. This question perhaps extends out a little further. This is from Robert again. Robert's in New York City. And he's wondering if there was any coordination among international BPP parties as opposed to between non-U.S. BPP party and one of the American chapters. Did any of these international chapters somehow coordinate or communicate? And what was the U.S. government's response to these individual international BPP chapters?
Yes, so once the international section is set up in Algeria, again, folks came from various parts of the globe. And then you have all these conferences in the Caribbean, the Bandung Conference. You have all these Black Power revolutionary type conferences where the Panthers, especially international section, went. So Kathleen, Emory Douglas, naming all these Oakland founding members who were abroad at the time. Eldridge Cleaver's in exile. They travel. So yes, there are those connections there. That's why you have all these chapters in places like Bermuda and all these Black Power episodes along the Caribbean, Africa, and Tanzania. You still have Panthers living in some of these places today, like in Tanzania and Cuba and some of these various places. So yeah, those start connections. And people have written books about this, by the way. So you can find scholars who've already written about this, which is why my niece is interested in those who had no connection to the organization. Now, in terms of the government, you do get an exchange of international surveillance and pressure. And I'll just give you one example because I can go on and on and on this. So when I was at the National Humanities Center and I was working primarily with Sarah, she was able to give me unprecedented, unredacted, full every page of the Australian Secret Intelligence Organization in a PDF. It blows my mind that she can do this that fast. And I've been trying to get my hands on this stuff for years, but she did it in a couple of days. And in that, and searching through these, so the ICO, they will be the Australian version of the United States FBI, if that makes sense. And in those documents, I find that ICO was in America, surveilling African American activists, following people like Jesse Jackson, trying to infiltrate the Nation of Islam, following Panthers. And so what I need to find out, which I haven't done due diligence, is find out if there's some State Department repression of exchange taking place, right? So in other words, the United States government know there's a foreign entity in our country following our citizens, particularly African Americans, or did they even care? Or is this is a working relationship? So those are the things that I'm working with my colleague Keto Swan, for example, who I was able to recruit to IU, who's familiar with digging inside these State Department records to try to figure out what these connections are and if they exist. But I was not just upset, I was very angry to find out that here we are with secret foreign intelligence surveilling African Americans in our communities because of the impact that we were having on groups like the Australian Black Panther Party, who was emulating them in Australia. But so we don't think of Australia as a place of international espionage, for example. But they're right here in America, all over, up and down the streets of Chicago, Oakland, New York, following Black folks around. So you do have those kinds of episodes at play.
Fantastic, thank you. This next question comes from Cassie. Cassie is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and is currently a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill and works as an RA. And so her question is the following. First of all, she wants to thank you for such an informative and intellectually invigorating lecture. She's been doing, again, this RA work regarding anti-apartheid and liberation movements in South Africa. She's wondering if there are any connections between the BPP and the ANC, the Black consciousness movements, or any other anti-apartheid efforts in South Africa or abroad internationally.
Yes, so you can find much of, if you read the Black Panther Party newspaper, they are reporting what's taking place around the world, because you get the black press as well in the United States, but the Panthers are reading a lot of what's taking place in these other contexts, right? So they're studying what's taking place in Soweto. They report on it in their newspapers. They keep their eyes to the prize on those in those regards. But unfortunately, I'm not an expert on. Well, I shouldn't say I'm not an expert. I just don't have. I hate speaking about things as if I'm an expert on certain subjects. A lot of us get these PhDs and think we're expert in everything. We're not. So I haven't studied that in great detail. I can speak more to the other revolutionary struggles in Africa that are taking place, not in South Africa itself, but in other parts of Africa where I know the party went, met with people, even did trainings and things of that nature. But I do know that the Panthers are in solidarity with the movement that's taking place in South Africa. They are not opposed to the ANC, because the ANC has taken a war to those Afrikaners, right? They're blowing up things. They deal with police brutality. They give just as good as they get. This is why they don't have a nonviolent civil disobedience approach in South Africa, and the Panthers are advocates of that, right? They're arguing that under the ideology of Malcolm X, no one has ever gained their freedom by singing and marching, that you have to fight for, and that's what everyone around the world at that time is doing and winning. And so the Panthers are writing about and reporting what's taking place in South Africa in solidarity with them. But I haven't looked in great detail in the connection that you're asking about.
Great, thank you. This next question comes again from Charlottesville. This is from Henry. Henry's wondering, a couple of times tonight, Professor, early on and then just a moment ago, you mentioned Jesse Jackson, and it seemed like you did so a little dismissively, or you had a certain tone to your voice. What are your feelings about Jesse Jackson in this context?
I'm laughing because it was dismissive, but I don't have a gripe with Reverend Jesse Jackson. So let me start by saying I have the utmost respect for Reverend Jesse Jackson. I thank him for the work and activism he has done. However, I can't romanticize. You got to call a spade with a spade. He had nothing to do with the original Rainbow Coalition, and he appropriated it for his own political means. So, I write about this in chapter 6 of the book. Fred Hampton and the original Rainbow Coalition create the original Rainbow Coalition. Illinois chapter of Black Panther Party create the original Rainbow Coalition, and their ideology is not to run anyone for office, right? Their idea is to overthrow the capitalist structure. But Fred Hampton's assassinated, and once he's assassinated, the Panthers take people through that Bullis Rapper's apartment. There's 13 years of subsequent trials led by people from the People's Law Office. Many of these books have been written, Jeff Haas and others who were lawyers of those trials. And the Supreme Court, we find out later, it goes out of the Supreme Court, and these folks have to settle out of court because the Supreme Court didn't rule because they were going to set precedents. Everyone involved in the murder of this young kid because of political beliefs was going to prison, from the head of the FBI up to Nixon. Everyone's going to prison. So they set out of court and paid his family $1.85 million. And it's the only time the United States government, city of Chicago and others, admitted guilt that they killed a citizen because of his politics. At that time, people like Harold Washington and others, politicians, also toured that Bullis Rapper's department and decided that this was horrible and convinced the Rainbow Coalition to join forces with them. So they pulled the coalition to the political arena. That was not their idea. Jesse Jackson does the funeral for one of the people who does the funeral for Fred Hampton. In fact, one day after Fred Hampton is assassinated, there's an attempt made on the real leader of the Illinois chapter's party, which is Bobby Rush, later U.S. Congressman Rush, and Jesse Jackson helps to hide him. So there's some connections there. So I don't want to just outright diss Jesse Jackson. At the time, Jesse Jackson had Operation Breadbasket. There's all these various conversations that's been written about that I can document as well. Jesse Jackson advocating on behalf of poor people and for a capitalist reason. Jesse is a capitalist. These groups are socialists. They're anti-capitalist. And just like capitalists, folks find commodities that are useful and that are valuable, and they appropriate them. And so he's no different. So once Harold Washington is elected the first African-American mayor of Chicago, he creates what he calls his Rainbow Cabinet. So all these Panthers, the young lords, Puerto Ricans, the young patriots, poor whites, women, Latinos, people with disability, they're all part of his cabinet, the Rainbow Cabinet. And Jesse Jackson, the light bulb goes off. Wow, this black man used his Rainbow Coalition to get elected mayor of Chicago, the most racially segregated city in America. Some of those racial strife took place during that election, and his coalition got him. So he found out that the coalition wasn't trademarked, so he trademarked it. So if you say Rainbow Coalition Day, you got to pay Jesse Jackson, hence my disdain. The Rainbow Coalition was a call to arms of class solidarity amongst poor people, socialists who are anti-capitalist. And Jesse Jackson appropriated it in 1983 after Harold Washington was elected, and the next year he ran for president. And he called it the Rainbow Push Coalition. The time he Operation Push, he trademarked Rainbow Coalition, Rainbow Push Coalition. So that's my disdain there. Not that I have any disrespect for Jesse Jackson. I just can't sugarcoat it. He's a capitalist. Now, at that same time, Jesse Jackson revolutionized the Democratic Party using racial coalition politics. That's chapter 6 of the book, when I argue it's not by action the black president comes out of Chicago. Everyone steals the coalition ideology in politics. Jesse Jackson does it. David Axelrod does it. Barack Obama does it. Everyone does it. None of them are married to the politics. Only Harold Washington. But Jesse was the first to make it what it is. So I give him, Reverend Jackson. So I give him the utmost respect. I have no bones to pick with Jesse Jackson. It's just as a scholar, as a historian, I can't romanticize. I can't sugarcoat. This is what it is. Now, you can see the way in which the youth today have some issues with Jesse Jackson. There's plenty of times he'll show up at Black Lives Matter rallies or campaigns, and you get booed off the stage, and folks don't want to do. But that's a conversation for another day.
Great, thank you. Thank you for being very direct and honest about that. And I appreciate again, Henry, bringing the question forward. Just time for a few more questions. This next one comes from Elena. Elena is our TA tonight, and again, a high school teacher in Southern Pines, North Carolina. And she's wondering, particularly in the very charged political climate that all these educators in our audience tonight are working in, whereby the parents and the school boards and the general public are interested in what they teach and the choices they make, the critical race theory controversy. In your opinion, what's the best way for to teach about the impact of the Black Panther Party or other grassroots groups here in the U.S. and these countries today, with so many states passing laws to restrict talking about race? What kind of advice can you give educators for tackling these topics?
So I'm an activist first, scholar second. So professor is what I do. This is my profession, not who I am. I'm an activist first. So I'm very much involved in and been traveling the states, United States, advocating on behalf of opposing such legislation. Here in Indiana, we had HB 167, for example. We have all these various bills, critical race theory. I live in a red state. I'm in Penn State, for example, for crying out loud. So we have these issues all the time. These are not new phenomenons. What I like to do is tell teachers to be true to the history, kind of like the example that I gave of Jesse Jackson. So you are taking a risk because parents are involved in ways in which I just don't think parents should be. Not that parents shouldn't be involved, but you got to give teachers the ability to do their job. So what I try to do is focus on the how and the why. So what parents and this anti-critical race theory want you to do is only teach the who, what, when, and where. Right? There's no critical thinking involved in that. That's not how history is done. There's something happened at a particular time, a particular person is involved in a particular place. But the how and the why is always up for debate, and that's what makes teachers so profound. You have to have these open, honest conversations in the classroom. And so if you couch it in how and why, then you're not really taking a position. It's just opening up the debate around why something happened and how it took place and what its effects are today and then. So, for example, if we dealt with some of these issues in the past, we wouldn't be dealing with some of these issues today, where some of these issues are still around. So I think I'll end there before I jump on my soapbox, and I know we're running out of time.
Professor Jacoby Williams, thank you so much for leading the conversation tonight, for sharing the research and the work that you've done, and also giving, I think, everyone in the audience some some scholarly, emergent, evidence-based ways to defend the things that they're talking about. And I very much appreciate you drawing that distinction between activists and scholarship and scholar, and the ways that they work together. Jacoby, thanks again.
Thank you all for having me. I enjoyed this.
And I want to thank the entire audience for joining us tonight for this webinar. Please do follow our social media feeds, including Twitter, for upcoming activities and opportunities, including an announcement on the application process for our Teaching Social Justice Institute in July of 2022. I hope you join us for our next webinar on January the 25th. I'll be joined by a duo, Sandy Darity, past fellow at the center, and his wife, Kirsten Mullins, a community activist in Durham, North Carolina, will be sharing their work on reparations. The episode is titled 40 Acres in the 21st Century, Black Reparations Today. If you haven't signed up, please don't go and do so. If that night doesn't work for you, I hope we see you at a future Humanities in Class webinar series. Have a great day at school tomorrow, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thanks again.